So visualizations are a powerful means to tell a story. Did anybody spot the mistake in this slide? Exactly. So you have to always remember to tell the story. That is the first rule of data visualization. Unlike this epic fail that somebody caught on Twitter, which I love. That is just not how graphs work. It is important to accurately reflect your data with your visualization. So, it should go without saying, but it's always worth saying to try and be as accurate as possible. So, we're back to our rather simple visualization. Who can tell me the meaning of this? It's the numbers under 10 again. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I was in a different place. Right, so we have this. This isn't bad. We're highlighting the outliers in our data, but perhaps we think we can do better. Perhaps we think if we order our numbers, this might help organize the data, create a better visualization for our users. And we've been messing around with our visualization. It's probably a lot more complicated than this. We've been fiddling around with it for a while. And then the kind person sitting next to you, your teammate, says, I finally have the data ready. And your visualization all of a sudden looks like this. And the viz that you created does not work with the real data. I can't tell you how many times I've had this happen. And there's lots of ways a visualization might not work for your data. You might have overplotting, just have too many points on a screen as it turns out. You might have underplotting. You might have too much variation. You might have not enough variation. So one example that springs to mind is I was working with a designer. We had a designer doing sort of designy stuff. We had a client who had all the data that they were doing. We were coding stuff up with dummy data. And then eventually, the data came. And the designer had done this awesome thing, and there was going to be little spark lines, which, have their sort of just a line chart with no numbers on it that just give you an indication of trend. But when the data came in, there was just no trend to it because it was population-wise data and a bunch of other reasons. But that meant that the page just had a bunch of flat lines on it. And it was like the design looked amazing because the designer had drawn all these cute little scribbles on it. But because we hadn't been working with actual data, when we really brought it up for real, it just looked kind of sad. And we had at the last minute to sort of scramble and change it. Another thing that can happen is you might not have this message that you thought you did. So I was working with some other folks, and they were still working on the analysis, but they'd done like some, initial work, and it was a big, complicated modeling project, and so we had a long conversation about what was the message going to be, how are we going to tell this whole long story. And then I worked on it for a while, built all these visualizations, and then the data came through, and we'd mapped it all out, and they were like, oh, we've never actually seen it on a map. This doesn't tell the story we thought it did, and then you have to rethink. And so this is, I hope, not something that happens to you lot that often because you're working with your own data all the time. You're not necessarily designing visualizations for other people, but I think it is an important lesson, so I wanted to include it in this crowd. So hopefully we've covered the two easy lessons first. Try and be accurate and use the real data. Next, we're back to this again. I'll ask the question I was asking before. What is this plot showing? Too slow. It is showing how many numbers are between 23 and 44. And the point I want to make here is just the visualization is not enough. You have to have a title, you have to have the explanation, you have to lead your readers along the way. So you need to prompt your audience, that might be your colleagues, your boss, the public at large, as to what they're looking for. And there's some really good quotes from journalism, I think, here, and from writing. Don't overestimate the public's knowledge, but don't underestimate their intelligence. So don't assume that they have all the background that you have, that you've brought to this amazing analysis that you've done, but also don't assume that people are stupid. You don't have to spell things out painfully. You don't have to dumb things down. I think perhaps the more like succinct version for us is assume an intelligent, impatient reader. And we have all been an intelligent, impatient reader. And I think if you've ever emailed somebody and be like, hey, how's your analysis looking? And you get this back, and you're like, thanks, chart title, no labels on the axes, a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet. This is going to take you a while to like dig into somebody else's spreadsheet. You're lucky if it looks this nice. Oftentimes it's like even more impenetrable than this. And so I think always assume when you're trying to convey your results to somebody to assume an intelligent, impatient reader. At the very least, break out the answer you're trying to give someone, label your axes, give the chart a title, and write that succinct explanation of like what the person is meant to take away from this. So, telling your data story. You should be as accurate as possible. You should use your data. And when telling your story, assume an intelligent and impatient reader. So, we're creating a visualization. We're creating a story. There's a famous saying in writing, like show, don't tell. And there's a lot of stuff on the internet about whether that's really how writing works. But the point is, sorry, I got my slides out of order. The point, I think, in data visualization is that you want to show and tell. You have a message to tell. You have something very specific you're hopefully trying to convey, in most cases. But showing that act of like somebody looking at the data and seeing it for themselves is that really sort of that connection that means that they didn't just hear it, they didn't just listen to your argument, they saw your evidence and they now know that for themselves and they can go on and communicate your message. And that's where I think the visualization is very important, is that show and tell aspect. And at this point I did want to sort of just highlight the difference, which is probably hopefully obvious, between exploratory and explanatory. Exploratory is what we're all doing every day. It's that analysis. And explanatory, which is what we're really talking about today, is that reporting and that talking about the results of your findings. So the very first question, before you send somebody that Excel spreadsheet with a random chart in it, or you make some massive presentation to your whole company, or you put up a dashboard or whatever it is, you have to ask, what is your message? Is it something as simple as sales in the Southeast region are up? Or is it some, complex scientific discovery about how multiple processes in the brain work and, how you can do this new analysis and you've won a Nobel Prize? Who knows? Either one of these, it's the same process for trying to communicate that well. Along with I think this is sort of an iterative loop, you have to sort of consider them all at the same time, is why? Why are you telling this person? Why does this person care? Do they care because they're going to make a decision about it quickly? Do they care because they're trying to learn everything that you've learned? Are you communicating to your colleagues? Are you communicating to a higher up that just wants a brief analysis of what you're doing? Why are you even sending that email or writing or making this presentation in the first place? And then, who are you talking to? And what the message is, why you're doing it, and the who you're doing it to are probably all going to sort of feed into the same question of what's the message here. And if you can answer that well, you're a really, really long way to getting this right. So we've got our data, we have an impatient reader, and we have the impatient reader can also be you in 6 months' time, don't forget that. Any of us who've ever written code that's always true. And then you've got the message. Like what are you trying to say to who and why? So if any of you have ever met me before or you were at the tutorial yesterday, I can be fairly verbose. Some people are out loud thinkers, some people are internal thinkers. But when I try and do this properly, I often think of a message as like a decision tree. It gets more and more detailed, and I often start down here because that's where I like to live, but I try and work hard to like boil it up and make it more succinct. So, are we making this version of a T-Rex? Are we doing the super beautiful, shaded, nuanced, subtle version of the T-Rex? You know, that long message that we're trying to convey? Are we doing this version of the T-Rex, which is about where my art skills lie? Are we doing this version of the T-Rex? Or are we doing this version of the T-Rex where you just tell people that the standard deviation along X is 19 and then they'll figure it out? These are the same pieces of information, and this is another good reason to always visualize your data. I got this, Alberto Cairo tweeted this out as the Anscomosaurus. If any of you are familiar with Anscombe's quartets, I think it can now firmly be replaced with the Anscomosaurus. That was a random tangent. So, which version of the message are you telling? These are all valid versions of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. It depends on what you're trying to tell, to who, why, and so on. And I think there are two ways that I, in my career, this is not an absolute statement at all. There are two ways that I've approached data visualizations, and one is narrative in pieces, and the other one is like a custom visualization. And narrative in pieces is basically kind of some kind of report where you're just trying to visualize everything. You show you're working along the way, and you provide just sort of a graphical overview in the same way you might a presentation. And I can show an example of one of those later if we have time. But today I'm going to focus on a custom visualization, a kind of, what would you call it? Like what's the word? Where you do one big piece of viz that really captures your idea, and that's what the reader takes away with them. And so I brought a couple of examples of this. The first one is this rather awesome visualization of a history of sumo wrestling from 538. It's got this interactive slider. Every trail on here is a different sumo wrestler. You can switch the X and Y axis to their height, or that's height and weight, and so on and so forth, and you can really mess around with it, and it's quite fascinating. If you highlight over a dot, you'll see some information about each sumo wrestler. In this rather epic interactive from the New York Times, we see voting demographics broken out into really, really, really specific demographics. So there's a little legend that is too small for you guys to read on the bottom here of race. So pink is white, green is black, purple is Hispanic, and yellow is Asian or other. And then, you know, this person here, this is white men aged 65 and older with postgraduate degrees in Maryland. And so if I was to just highlight the postgrads, turnout is on the y-axis here. We can see this thing. Anyway, this is a super fun viz. I really enjoy voting election data. As a new US citizen with the election coming up, I've got a little bit excited. So there we have that. And then yesterday, we started to talk about the Gapminder example. This is a fairly famous example of statistical visualization from Hans Rosling, where you can see all of the countries of the world changing over time. And one of his main messages is that back in the 50s, when the term sort of the third world and the first world were coined, countries were sort of distinctly separated. But over the last 50, 60 years, countries have really started to merge together in a sort of blob of development, and everybody's sort of moving up and to the left in this case. And this is fine, but this is better.
From the crew. So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400,000, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubble showed the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the...
All right, so a fabulous history lesson from Hans Rosling. And the difference between this just churning away and what we just saw is that fabulous narrative that he brought along, where he paused at different points and he explained what was going on, and he told you the little narratives, the little vignettes that were leading you through that story and brought you along. It's not enough to have a fancy visualization, although people will be perfectly happy if you make this. But if you really want to convey that meaning that you probably see in your data, you see all of those little details because you've been slaving over your numbers forever. Other people don't see that, even if it is your colleagues. You know, your analysis is the work that you know best. And if you want to communicate it, you have to go that extra mile. Obviously, there's a difference between shooting off an email and, you know, making some kind of presentation once a year that's like a capstone for, you know, whatever piece of work you're going to be doing. But I think that, this for me, Hans Rosling does a really nice job of bringing that point out. And so I want to rewind to the sumo and the voting things we saw from the New York Times. I cheated a little bit. They didn't just throw you in at the deep end of the interactive. On both of those projects, what you start with is this. This is the sumo one. We start with the history, and they've set this in context of various historical events. Then they zoom in and like give you one little narrative about one particular legend in sumo wrestling. They zoom out again to the modern master, bringing it up to the present, hopefully something you can relate to. They sort of start to help you see the trends in the data. Now they introduce the fact that there's some interactive portions that are going to be bringing other elements of this out. And then finally, you're left back at where we started with the ability to explore this yourself. But without that context and that work that they did to just take you through some sort of views on this interactive that you built, really help you then be able to dig into it and pull out what you want to pull out. Similarly with the New York Times, this is the original article that it started with. It starts with a giant blob explaining that about 60% of citizens voted just over half for Obama. Then it breaks it out by race, introducing you to the color differences. Then by education, introducing the next split that they've put into the data. Then they've put the gender into the data. Next, the age, and finally the state. And then at the very bottom of all of this, you can go and click on this link and get into that interactive. And you'll notice what they said here. Find yourself in these charts. And maybe I'm an egomaniac, but I don't think it's just me. I think it's a very natural instinct to want to go and find yourself in data, to click your race, your sex, your gender. When you look at a map, I think one of the reasons, I've been trying to find research about this, so if anybody does have a paper about this, then I'd be really interested to read it. But I think one of the reasons that maps are such a popular visualization, even though they're oftentimes not the best visualization for a data, is because we like to find ourselves in data. And so, a lot of times I might put, people say, we want a map. It's like, okay, well, map isn't necessarily the right thing, but maybe you put a map next to something that better highlights the point, because you're sort of taking that compromise between something that engages with somebody and something that's really highlighting the message you're trying to make. And I don't know how many of you noticed it, but Hans Rosling did this too. He wound back to 1948 and said, and Sweden won the medals, and this is the year I was born. And that was a really nice way of just taking that moment to personalize the data, and maybe next time you look at that, you'll find your year and see how the world was, when you were born. I don't know, but it's that little thing that makes that connection between you and the reader. So I've got about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to, I'll save some questions for time at the end, but I wanted to take a little bit of a dive into doing this with Bokeh. This is super brief, and I've posted the code. That you're going to see online, so you can check it out later. And I hope that we can continue this conversation online if it's something you're interested in. So yesterday at the tutorial, we went through the very basics of how to use Bokeh to do simple things like make a scatter plot, to maybe change the formatting on the axes, to maybe start to style it a little bit and add a hover, to start to use a linear interpolator to make that size bubble, to use a color mapper to map the regions, add a legend to the plot, and then, is this still working? Yes. And then, use interactors in the IPython notebook to build in that interactivity. But what we can do to try and bring together the lessons from today is we can make that effort to help lead people through, at least introduce them to our visualization. So this is all written with a Bokeh server app, and it starts a little bit blank and welcome. I've totally ripping off Hans Rosling here. I spent a lot of my life ripping off Hans Rosling, but he makes really good examples. So I've highlighted the poor and the sick and the rich and the wealthy. Now I've brought the legend in on the right, and I'm noting that countries are colored by region. Now I'm bringing the countries to the foreground and noting that they're sized by population. And on the next slide, we click into it auto-forwarding through the years. And you can pause, and you can go back and have at it. Now, this is not the most slick example by any stretch of the imagination, but it is very achievable. And so I wanted to show you some of the code. And of course, I didn't make this big. Hang on. Sorry. I wanted to show you some of the code to do this because it's a very, it's not that hard to do something that simple. And it's possible to make it much more slick, but I wanted to show that it is achievable. Sorry. PyData, North Carolina, talk. Yes. Yes, definitely. 1 second. Great. Right. So, is that readable? Yes? Okay. So if you were in the tutorial yesterday, this will hopefully look familiar. I have a method that makes a plot. I'm using that because I'm going to do it over and over again. I'm going to zoom down to the bottom. I have some buttons, and I have a next button, a previous button. This is a super janky way to do this, but it works, and that's the point, right? What can you hack together that works? Because we don't have unlimited time to mess around with JavaScript. So we have a next button, a previous button, and then we have a global variable frame, and next just increments and decrements frame. Then I have this very, very ugly method here, and it just says, if frame is 0, do this. If frame is 1, do this. It's not rocket science. Any one of these frames should look like fairly straightforward bokeh code that you could make just as an individual plot in a cell. So I'm not going to dwell on it too much. Hopefully, if you're interested in doing something like this, then you can piece it together between reading this code, looking at the tutorial notebooks from yesterday, and this will all make sense. The one thing that I did want to highlight is that I picked the crudest way of doing this possible. You'll notice that the whole page kind of refreshes when I switch between the buttons. And I did this by replacing all of the children of the layout. This is a great place to start if you're trying to use bokeh in this way, just to replace like the whole layout when you're switching something up. You could do much more subtle things where you just made things appear and disappear and you kept more of the context, and I think that would be a much more pleasant experience. But that's a nice place to start. So this is what I wanted to say. When you're telling your data story, be as accurate as you can with your data. Use your data to do your design work, or you will weep as you get closer to your deadline. Think about upfront what the message is. What are you trying to say? Why are you trying to say it? Who are you trying to say it to? And craft that narrative accordingly. Assume an intelligent and impatient reader. Highlight illustrative examples like we saw in the sumo case and in all the cases we looked at, where you just pick out a specific detail which helps the user connect to what these different points that you're looking at mean. And if necessary, like, don't forget to add some documentation about how to use it if it's not immediately obvious. So I've got a little bit of time for questions, if anybody would like to ask any. Thanks.
And we want to get the questions on the microphone so it can be recorded. So who's got questions? My question is, who can take a picture of the slide? Because I definitely want to tweet that. Wow. All right, thank you. Get things going.
It's kind of a fish for information. So when you say document how to use, can you kind of describe, like, other than comments, good ways that you found to do that?
Sure. I think that it falls into two categories, one of which I don't have an example of, which is to, I'm sure many of you have gone to a page and had there's an arrow pointing to there's a drop down over here or something like that. In an example, in something, I should, no. Hopefully this won't take too long to load. In this example here, there's documentation about what the topic is, like top and bottom, but just in the next to the visualization, there's a small selector state to see more information. So I've put that information about how to use it, right in close context with the visualization, where the sort of more broader picture stuff is away in the actual website itself. The other way to do it is like how the 538 folks did, which is to switch the view. if you're going through this kind of progressive thing, to switch the view to try and give the user a sort of clue as to that's what's happening. Another choice I made on this example was I made the choice to start the animation so that, you know, your eye is going to be drawn down here to the slider. So there's like, I think it's more about wherever you can make it a subtle clue, that's the best way, because then it's going to be intuitive. You know, people aren't going to notice that they've had to look for something. And if that doesn't work, try and do a big arrow.
Other questions? I'll ask one. So I thought it was very insightful to talk about your exploration being different than your explanation. And I'm wondering if you have hints of when you transition from one to the other without kind of manipulating the data, or is it just when you have to present to somebody, when you have to present to the VP, or is there a certain time when you start?
It's as soon as you're not just talking to yourself. Yeah, I think because as soon as you're out of your own head, you're having to convey a whole bunch of implicit knowledge that you're not even aware that you've built up. So I think these skills in general, like maybe you work really hard on something that you craft for a big presentation, but I think they help you just communicate better to your colleagues on like a daily basis, because we all have stuff, you know, built-in assumptions every time we say something.
What other questions? My built-in assumption that you guys all are pining for questions. Anything else that you wanted Sarah to show, or kind of follow? Oh, questions up front. Sorry. Trying to get the back.
You mentioned a story where people looked at the visualization later and realized it didn't tell the story that they wanted to tell. In scientific papers, of course, we separate results from discussion, and results are very factual, and there's no narrative, and then the discussion would try to weave that into a story. But the benefit of doing something like that is that you have to show all the data, and you even have to show things that may conflict with the story that you want to tell. Whereas if you're choosing a visualization, often the temptation is to discard the things that don't jive with the message we want to share. How do you, from a journalistic perspective, there's always the ethical obligation to share data that tell the opposite. So what are your thoughts on how to balance that ethical obligation with trying to tell a nice narrative?
I think that's my husband's a science journalist, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about that topic, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that science seems to be mostly not repeatable, and that they're in science in general, I don't think we've gone far enough to present our results, make them replicable, make them shareable, and maybe more. Nature's taken some steps recently to publish IPython notebooks, and there's interesting things happening, right? And I think that if you could build a visualization that not only helped discuss your results but presented your results, right? If you could not make that separation, maybe you would be not editorializing, but actually being clearer and plainer about your results. I think that oftentimes results aren't as compelling as, obviously there's a push in publishing to make results more compelling than they are because you want to publish, and I think that words can do that more easily than a stark graphic. Another fun fact about visualization is that, so you can use this for good or evil. This is tiny, I'm sorry. You could say there's some correlation here. I think most people would see some correlation here. The more I make these axes bigger, the tighter that bubble is going to be, and the more strongly people are going to perceive a correlation. The closer in, the less people are going to perceive a correlation. Now the correlation hasn't changed. It's just the axes that have changed. And so, there are things like that you could use for good or evil to tell your message in either way. And that is where, what's the right answer there? There isn't one. There's just trying to be, fair with your data. I've started just randomly wandering on a topic. Did I answer your question?
I think it's just a point that's important for us to remember.
Yes.
You mentioned election results, and they do that all the time, right? In election results, they do that all the time, where in order to emphasize a point that they want to make, they may portray things in a certain fashion. It's just something that since we deal with data all the time, it's important for us to try to convey the truth and not necessarily just one side of the story.
I also think it's important to try and remember to step back from like the canned visualizations that we do when we're doing exploratory analysis, scatter plots, histograms, box plots or whatever, to step away from that and try and think of something that really expresses what you're trying to express. So I saw a paper, it was a machine learning paper, and they'd done a image plot of the Pearson correlation of a bunch of features. I'm like, this is not my specialty. Anyway, it was just basically like a heat map, and you were, and like you're so far removed from the point of what this whole thing was about that it's like you're not close to the message. So like when I was working on that, I tried to, I saw the point of what, the statistical analysis that had been done, but that visualization didn't really add anything to somebody coming to this to try and understand the point. So we had to think of fairly novel and new graphics to try and like actually just bring the fairly obscure thing of like picking out machine learning features and bring it back to the sort of fundamental question that you were trying to answer. So I think there's also space for that.
So I really enjoyed what you said so far. And one of the things I wanted you to comment a little bit more upon was when you look at static graphs, there's a long legacy of what looks good, what communicates well to people who don't see it all the time. But when you get to these interactive graphs, you've shown some nice examples, but where do you see the kind of best practices or who's doing a really good job of showing interactivity to people who don't look at graphs all the time so they can really understand what's going on? Rosling's a great example. Are there others?
So I think I picked out 3 of my favorites today, which is 538. I think does a really nice job. And most of 538 stuff is static, with just really modest interactivity. New York Times does a bunch of interactives, and we showed Hans Rosling. But I think, and this came up from there was a question in the audience yesterday about when to use interactives and when not to. I think the whole point of the talking about the snapshotting and how this, something like this like led you through the whole thing is that the only way to understand that massive blob of data is the snapshot first. And that is what's really teaching you about this thing. And then there's this opportunity to explore it. And so, the exploration is probably the me and the data kind of thing. So I think what, you asked this question yesterday, and I was thinking about it overnight, like why use an interactive charting library versus a static one? And I think what Bokeh lets you do, and others may too, but like I know Bokeh, is that you use Bokeh a lot, for example, to make static plots and you're doing your exploration. But when you want to move into more of a storytelling component, maybe you're not even using the interactivity in a way that feels like interactivity, right? Like jumping between these points is really just like jumping between slides. But what you've used is, interactive features to sort of help bring people through like static snapshots in a story. So yeah, this is something I'm still thinking about a lot to try. I don't have a lot of messages. Lots of good people have written about this, Alberto Cairo and Andy Kirk and the whole OpenVizConf, and there's lots and lots of good information online, but yeah, I'm still learning, so.
So with that, I'm going to go ahead and thank Sarah. We have a 10-minute break. We can do a round of applause.